it's more vulnerable, as we've seen, to attacks from the air. It's more vulnerable on the front line because it doesn't have the indirect fire capability with the HIMARS rockets and with artillery ammunition to deal with the groupings of Russian forces as they prepare to come in. But it's still killing between 900 and 1,000 Russian soldiers a day. 20 to 40 pieces of Russian equipment today. 10 to 20 tanks a day are being destroyed. That's significant. Russia is using meat grinder tactics to just punch up against the Ukrainians. And almost whenever you're getting into that point where they don't care about the casualties, no matter how much ammunition you've got, they're just going to push through at some stage. Ukraine hasn't quite got the engineering assets to be able to deliver different layers of defensive positions to fall back on solely whilst waiting for this ammunition and the rest of the military material to come forward.
You mentioned, Philip, Russia's meat grinder tactics, and obviously you need fresh troops to feed into the meat grinder, as it were. Are you expecting to hear more potentially from Putin after his inauguration today about a fresh wave of Russian mobilization?
Yeah, I think he'll do everything he can to try and mobilize by stealth. So he'll find different ways of finding more people to come through. But as it gets worse, and it will get worse for him, he's going to have to come into more public mobilization. And we're beginning to see the rhetoric behind that. It's been building up for quite some time. Describing this conflict as not being a conflict against Ukraine. It's a conflict against the West. He's trying to defeat NATO. It's NATO that's attacking Russia. Russia is under threat. And even with this speech that he gave today at the end of his inauguration, he was talking about Russia's collective response and collective responsibility to deal with the threat. So he's building it up in people's minds that this is bigger than the issue that he started, and he's blaming everyone else for it.
I want to get your thoughts, Philip, on something we discussed on yesterday's episode of Frontline. I was joined by George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, and he was saying that he thinks it is feasible for Ukraine to launch a new counteroffensive against Russia in 2024, and he said there would be significant advantages to having one sooner rather than later, to launch one potentially in the autumn of 2024 as opposed to in 2025. Do you agree?
I do and I don't. I think Ukraine needs to make sure that they are ready to launch the counteroffensive. And what's made the counteroffensive that they launched last year not work? They didn't own the air. So, they couldn't create areas of air superiority for the ground forces then to fight through in. They didn't have the engineering assets to deal with the massively complex defenses that Russia had built around the Suvorikhin lines that are there. They didn't have the ammunition stocks and the numbers of troops ready to properly exploit that. So what have the Ukrainians done? They've effectively allowed the front line to freeze, and they're hollowing the Russians out from behind with what I've described before in this program as SOE-type tactics. General Bodanov, the head of the GUR or HUR, as they're called as well, the head of the military intelligence, is carrying out attacks on Russian oil refineries on logistic bases and command and control. He's been behind the sinking of almost 50% of the Black Sea Fleet. Air defense sites are being attacked. Russian airfields are being attacked, and everything else. That's hollowing them out. So when the Ukrainians are ready to punch through, hopefully those defenses are going to be an awful lot weaker, because what's behind them, there's little substance. But he needs to get the Western aircraft in. The pilots need to have the ammunition. They need to have the experience in the aircraft to be able to provide that local air defense or air superiority bubble around any ground offensive that's in. And then there needs to be the all-armed fight. And we haven't seen the Ukrainians use their armored forces in a mass way yet. That's how we'd see them used from a Western perspective. We see a brigade or a division level attack. We're seeing the Ukrainians using the tanks in ones or twos, and we're seeing the casualties coming through in ones or twos. That's the old Soviet style tactics that the Russians are using. And there's a lot more to go. So they could potentially go this year. The autumn's not the best time because the ground gets too soft for Western tanks and Western armoured vehicles. But I think it's probably more likely and possibly better for them if they can continue this hollowing out late spring, early summer 2025.
You mentioned, Philip, Vladimir Putin and his increasing rhetoric of a war not just with Ukraine, but against the West. And I wonder if that feeds into the fact that we've now got European intelligence agencies warning that Russia is planning, and I quote, violent acts of sabotage across Europe as part of a more aggressive and concerted effort against the West. What form do you think those attacks would take?
Oh, that's the $6 million question. Russia has attacked the West. It's attacked the UK. It's attacked the UK with weapons of mass effect. You look at the poisoning of Litvinenko with polonium 210. If you look at the poisoning of Sergei Skripal, his daughter Yulia, in Salisbury with Novichok, its first use of a nerve agent on the streets of the UK or the streets of Europe, or the first one that we'd discovered at that stage. Looking back, it seems the Russians have been using it beforehand, and we're getting stories coming through of companies that are linked to Ukraine, their warehouses and other things mysteriously catching fire in London. Now, the Russians have got the ability through their organizations associated with their military intelligence, the GRU, to put saboteurs in different places. Whether those saboteurs are going to carry out more Novichok type poisonings, or whether mysterious fires are going to come out, or whether it's going to be something more serious, we see a growth in terrorism. That's a possibility. A greater possibility and probability is what we're going to see is Russia trying to stimulate other groupings that are operating across Europe and in the UK to carry out more violent acts. So, potentially ISIS or Al Qaeda, Islamist-related terror organizations suddenly find that they're getting training and help and sponsorship and access to weapons and explosives from a source that they don't know. That source would likely be Vagner, which is linked to the GRU. And of course, they're operating throughout Africa, so we've got the links into the command and control that there is in these terror organizations. And we are already saying what Russia's doing in the information domain. We shouldn't underestimate the power of the information domain to create protests, to create disruption and all the rest of it across the country. We're seeing the protests in support of the Palestinians causing disruptions in many countries across the world and causing real political dilemmas. Russia will be behind a lot of that. That's something that people don't realize. They'll be funding a lot of what's going on and helping to stimulate it because they can see a fracture, they can see political influence, and they'll put the proverbial knife in and wiggle it to see how far it goes. So I think we're already being attacked.
It's interesting you mentioned that example of the business in London that its warehouse was attacked. I think it was a Ukrainian-owned parcel delivery business. There was also a depot in Spain, I think, that was targeted, and it was Ukrainian-owned, and previously they'd helped with the transportation of humanitarian aid to Lviv at the very outbreak of the war. So interesting that was targeted. But also interesting that reportedly the person, one of the people involved, was recruited by Vagner. Do Vagner still have much of a role these days?
Wagner have got a huge role. And there were a couple of people that have been arrested for that arson attack, have been arrested under the new secrecy laws that are on the UK. So that points to something really quite interesting. Now, Wagner never really went away. They moved when Prigozhin's coup, if it was a coup, failed. They moved more into Africa. They've been underpinning a lot of the oligarchs' business interests, collective oligarchs' business interests in Africa with mines, with wood, with propping up governments and other natural resources that are around. And that's where the real influence is. And Moscow has taken more central control of Wagner. It was set up as a private army to do the dirty work on behalf of Putin in different places across the world before Ukraine had happened. The first bit of dirty work they did was get involved in the capture of Crimea in 2014. But their power has been used elsewhere. Putin has wrestled them back into more central control after what Prigozhin had done. Prigozhin, was it an attempted coup? It was probably more him protesting the fact that the relationship that he had with the defense minister wasn't right, and ammunition was being withheld. This is a spat between oligarchs. That is being played out in the military activity that's going on, and it's criminal fighting criminal. And of course, the criminal in chief is the head oligarch, and the head oligarch in Moscow, in Russia, is Vladimir Putin himself.
So if we're going to see an increasing number of these acts of sabotage against Western nations, what should the appropriate response be from the West, Philip?
Well, we can send another stiff letter to the United Nations, or get our ambassador to deliver one to the Kremlin in Moscow. It's very difficult to attribute it. And I think what we'll find is that our intelligence services, who are very good indeed, these sorts of attacks will be in the same sort of guise as terrorist attacks and other bits and pieces potentially. We have, since the horrible attacks in 2017, our intelligence services in the UK have stopped almost 40 late-stage attacks because they've got their finger on the pulse. And we'll find that our intelligence services are redoubling their effort to look at this as a potential new threat and deal with it from that perspective. So I think we should have confidence that the majority of it, there will be a handle on it. It's just worrying that if the Russians are doing it and they put a lot of resources behind it, they only need to be successful once or twice, whereas our intelligence services need to be successful all of the time to stop this. But it's a worrying development. We just have to monitor it closely.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more, click subscribe on our YouTube channel. You can listen to Times Radio, and you can read more about the war in Ukraine and global security with your Times digital subscription.